struggling single mom waitress gives her blanket to a cold homeless man. She had no idea he was a billionaire. She was exhausted, cold, and heading home after yet another double shift. Just another night in a life full of struggle, overdue rent, an empty fridge, and a daughter waiting in the dark. But then she saw him, a figure hunched alone on a frozen bench, shivering in silence. She only hesitated for a moment before doing something no one else did. What she gave away that night seemed small. Insignificant, even. But it wasn't. It was the beginning of something neither of them could have predicted. And by the end of it all, her life would never be the same. Before we go further, please ensure to like, share, and subscribe for more interesting stories like this one. The alarm buzzed long before the sun thought about rising. Sarah blinked into the darkness, her fingers blindly searching for the snooze button. It was always like this. Her body heavy with exhaustion, her mind already racing through the day ahead. Bills overdue. Rent unpaid. A stack of final notices tucked away in a kitchen drawer she barely opened anymore. But none of that could stop the morning, and none of it could stop her. From the corner of the room came a small cough. Lily stirred in her tiny bed, a mattress laid neatly on the floor beside Sarah's own. The 3-year-old clutched a stuffed bunny with a missing ear, her cheeks warm with sleep. Sarah sat up slowly, careful not to wake her. This was her only moment of peace. A pause. A breath. The part of the day where survival hadn't yet taken full control. The apartment was small, barely more than 2 rooms, but Sarah had made it a home. Mismatched furniture, hand-me-down curtains, a cracked coffee pot that only worked if she held the button down. There were no luxuries, but there was warmth. There was love. And even in the middle of her struggle, there was an invisible thread of hope. She slipped into the bathroom, splashed cold water on her face, and pulled her thick, curly hair into a bun. The mirror was unforgiving. The lines under her eyes seemed deeper this week, her skin dull, her shoulders tired. But she didn't have time for vanity. She had 25 minutes to get herself dressed, wake Lily, prepare breakfast, and make it to the bus stop. The kitchen offered little help. Half a loaf of bread, a single egg, no milk, no coffee. Sarah knew how to make it stretch. She cracked the egg into a small bowl, whisked it with water, and poured it onto a skillet for Lily. She would eat toast. Lily would never go hungry, not while Sarah had anything left to give. By the time Lily's eyes fluttered open, Sarah had laid out her daycare clothes and warmed up her egg. "Good morning, baby," she whispered, brushing a kiss onto Lily's forehead. The little girl smiled, still lost in the warmth of dreams, and reached for her bunny. Sarah dressed her with practiced precision, tying her shoelaces while mentally calculating how much she had left on her prepaid bus card. The neighbor across the hall, Mrs. Nellie, an elderly widow with a kind heart and a sharper tongue, opened her door as Sarah knocked. "Right on time," the woman said, ushering Lily in with a smile. She never asked for money, not anymore. She knew Sarah didn't have any. Instead, Sarah paid her in casseroles on payday and helped with grocery runs. It wasn't much, but it was honest. The diner wasn't far, just 2 bus rides and a 4-block walk. By the time Sarah arrived, the sun was up and the city was humming. Inside, the air smelled of burnt coffee and fried bacon. She tied on her apron, scribbled her name on the staff sheet, and pasted on a smile. It didn't matter how she felt. This job demanded her best face, her best manners, her best everything. The morning rush came like a wave. Construction workers, cab drivers, office folks grabbing breakfast before heading downtown. Sarah moved like a machine, refilling cups, juggling plates, dodging hands that lingered too long or comments that cut too deep. Some people thought being a waitress meant being invisible. Others treated her like she owed them a show. Either way, Sarah smiled. Because smiles meant tips. And tips meant diapers and rent, and maybe a new pair of shoes for Lily when hers gave out. At noon, she got 5 minutes. She sat on an overturned milk crate in the back alley, sipping lukewarm water from a plastic cup. Her phone buzzed, a message from the electric company. Final notice. Again. She sighed, slid the phone back into her pocket, and stood. Breaks were luxuries she couldn't afford. The afternoon crawled. The dinner shift was worse. Kids crying. Couples arguing. Teenagers leaving behind wrecked tables and coins instead of tips. Her feet ached, her hands stung from hot plates, and still she moved. Table to table, smile to smile. The manager, a tired man named Steve, called her over. "Someone called off," he said. Can you stay and cover the night? Sarah wanted to say no. Her body screamed for rest. But Lily needed diapers. The rent was late. She nodded. Of course. By 10 p.m., her back was soaked in sweat, her fingers sore. The diner had emptied out except for a pair of regulars nursing coffee and life stories at the counter. Sarah wiped down the booths, counted tips, and tucked each dollar away like gold. She could stretch $47. She always did. The cold hit her the moment she stepped outside. It was the kind of sharp, bitter wind that made your eyes water and your skin sting. She pulled Lily's blanket from her bag, a faded, well-loved thing stitched with little stars, and wrapped it around her shoulders. It had once been part of a nursery set from a thrift store. Now, it traveled with her, a constant reminder of home, of her daughter, of warmth when the world felt too harsh. As she walked to the bus stop, she kept her head down, her thoughts distant. Just a few more days until payday. Just enough time to breathe before the rent came due again. She didn't know how she'd make it. She never really did. But somehow she always managed. And yet, something lingered in the air that night. A quiet stillness beneath the wind. An unseen pair of eyes watching her move down the sidewalk, blanket trailing behind her like a banner of quiet strength. She didn't notice him. Not yet. Not tonight. But what she had done, who she was, how she lived, it had already been seen. And everything was about to change. The wind had turned mean by the time Sarah stepped off the last bus. Midnight clung to the sky like a cold sheet, blanketing the city in silence. Her breath came out in clouds, puffing into the empty street as she hugged Lily's blanket tighter around her shoulders. The thin fabric barely helped, but it was better than nothing. The faded stars embroidered along the hem brushed against her arm, their softness a small comfort in a night full of chill. She was used to this now, the routine of walking the final blocks home in the dark, alone, beneath flickering street lamps and the occasional growl of a passing truck. The city seemed hollow at this hour. Stores locked tight, sidewalks deserted, only the faint hum of distant traffic and the low rattle of garbage bins tumbling in the wind. Her feet dragged with every step, each movement heavy with exhaustion. The double shift had drained her dry. She thought only of getting home, of curling beside Lily on the mattress, of rest. And then she saw him. At first, he looked like just another shape in the shadows. A bundle of rags, maybe an old coat draped over forgotten belongings. But as she drew closer, the shape moved, shifted. A cough broke through the air. She slowed her steps, squinting through the dim glow of the nearest lamp post. What she saw made her stop completely. A man, sitting alone on the bench outside the shuttered pharmacy. He was hunched over, his arms wrapped tightly around his chest. His clothes were thin. Layers of shirts, mismatched and worn, with holes at the sleeves and grime at every edge. A knit cap sat crooked on his head, his face nearly buried into his collar to escape the cold. His fingers were blue at the tips, shaking as he tried to pull his coat tighter. Sarah glanced around. No one. Not a soul on the street but her and this man. Her instincts kicked in, a quiet warning, a familiar caution, but it was overrun by something else, recognition. Not of the man himself, but of the look in his eyes. That look of quiet desperation, of just trying to make it through one more night. She didn't know his story, didn't know what led him to that bench, to that hour, to that cold. But she knew what it was to feel helpless, and hungry, and tired. She had stood at the edge of hopelessness more times than she could count. She didn't need to know his name to understand. Still, she hesitated. Lily's blanket was the only warmth she had. If she gave it up, she'd walk the last stretch home exposed to the freezing air. Her coat was more like a suggestion than protection, a thrift store find with a broken zipper and lining that barely held together. But she looked at the man again, and this time, her eyes settled on his hands. He was rubbing them together, a quiet, slow motion of someone trying to stay alive. She moved. Her steps were soft but deliberate as she crossed the street. She stopped just a few feet away, her heart thumping louder than she wanted to admit. "Sir," she said gently. The man looked up. Slowly. His eyes were sunken, rimmed with red, and startled by her presence. But he didn't speak. He just blinked. Sarah glanced down at the blanket, then back at him. "It's freezing tonight," she said. I don't have much, but this might help." She didn't wait for him to respond. She didn't give herself the time to reconsider. Her hands moved on their own as she pulled the blanket from around her shoulders and stepped closer, draping it over his frame with quiet care. His body flinched at first, surprised, but then stilled. The blanket settled on him like a quiet mercy. He looked up at her again, his lips parting just slightly. Why? That one word. Hoarse. Raw. Sarah offered a tired, crooked smile. Because you're cold, she said simply. And I know what that feels like. She turned before he could say anything else, before she let herself feel the chill creeping instantly into her bones. She crossed the street again, the cold gnawing at her skin, her arms now bare to the wind. She didn't look back. The blanket was gone, but something else clung to her, an odd, unfamiliar warmth, a quiet stillness in her chest, as if, somehow, despite everything she didn't have, she had given something that mattered. Behind her, the man watched. He didn't move, didn't call after her, but his eyes followed her as she walked, his breath slow, his fingers finally still beneath the warmth she'd left him. He touched the fabric, feeling the softness, the stitched stars, the subtle scent of something that reminded him of safety, of motherhood, of sacrifice. He didn't know her name, didn't know her story, but in that moment, he knew one thing for certain. She was the kindest soul he had met in years. The blanket clung to his shoulders like a lifeline. Richard Hale sat frozen on the bench, not from the cold, but from something else entirely. The moment had unfolded so quickly, so simply, that it almost didn't feel real. He had seen pity before. He had seen fear, dismissal, sometimes even anger. But kindness, unprovoked, unconditional, was rare, precious. He shifted slightly, pulling the blanket tighter around his chest. The softness surprised him. It was a child's blanket, worn and fraying along the edges. Yet it had been given to him as if it were nothing, as if it were everything. She had said, "You're cold." That was it. No dramatic speech, no hesitation, just a truth and an action. Richard leaned back against the bench, staring at the dark sky. His fingers clutched the corner of the fabric where a name was stitched in faded thread. Lily. So that was the child's name. He hadn't meant for the night to end like this. This whole thing, this entire past month, had been an experiment, a test, a way to reconnect with a part of the world he had forgotten, or perhaps deliberately ignored. Disguised in worn clothes and a tattered coat, he'd spent his nights drifting between shelters and sidewalks, observing, watching, waiting. He wasn't homeless. Not truly. Richard Hale was one of the wealthiest men in the state, a quiet investor with holdings in tech, real estate, logistics, and more. But for the past few years, he had begun to feel detached from the very society his money moved. Charity had become numbers on paper, generosity a tax bracket, and gratitude that had disappeared somewhere between board meetings and marble office floors. So he created a test. He wanted to see, for himself, whether the world still held decency, whether people, stripped of the incentive to impress or gain, would still act from compassion. He told no one the full reason. His security team followed from a distance, unseen but always present. He had a backup phone, a panic button, emergency cash. But otherwise, he was just another face in the crowd. In the 3 weeks since he started, most people had ignored him. A few tossed him change. Some looked through him like he didn't exist. He had taken notes, observed patterns, but nothing had moved him. Not until tonight. That woman, he didn't know her name, had given him something more than warmth. She had given without asking, offered without expecting. He could still hear her voice in the back of his mind. Kind, but tired. Like someone who had known pain but chose not to pass it on. Richard reached into the small pouch tucked beneath his coat and pulled out his recorder. It was scuffed from use, but still functional. He pressed the record button and began to speak, his voice quiet, rasped from weeks of cold air and minimal speech. Entry 32. Female subject. Early 30s. Location, 8th and Clarion. Time, 12:03 a.m. Subject observed exiting a late-night bus. Wore a diner uniform. Appeared fatigued. Approached without prompting. Offered a blanket, her only visible source of warmth. Child's name stitched into fabric, Lily. He paused, thinking. Subject did not request anything in return. Appeared sincere. Walked away immediately. Response was voluntary and empathetic. No ulterior motive detected. He stopped the recording and stared at the blinking red light as it faded. For the first time since this project began, something stirred inside him. It wasn't pity, and it wasn't charity. It was clarity. This woman, this stranger, had passed the test without even knowing she was taking one. He stood slowly, his joints protesting. He wasn't used to the weight of the street. Every muscle ached, but he would endure it for a few more nights if needed. Still, he had seen what he came to find. Compassion wasn't gone. Not entirely. He reached for his phone, the real one, hidden deep in his coat's lining. He turned it on, watching the screen glow back to life. Notifications buzzed. Missed calls. Messages. But he ignored them all and opened one thread. A contact listed only as G. He typed, "Found her. Start preparing the background check. Quietly. She doesn't need to know anything yet." Then he hit send. As he sat back down on the bench, cocooned in the warmth of a blanket meant for someone else, Richard Hale closed his eyes. Not to sleep. Not yet. But to remember her face. Her voice. Her choice. One act of kindness. That was all it took to change everything. Sarah moved like a ghost through the apartment. The door creaked shut behind her, the soft click of the lock echoing through the silence. The hallway light had blown out again, casting everything in a gray half-dark. Her hands trembled slightly as she removed her shoes, wincing at the dull throb in her feet. The cold had sunk deep into her skin during the walk home. She rubbed her arms, trying to warm them, but the chill remained more emotional now than physical. The first thing she noticed was how quiet it was. Not the peaceful kind of quiet. The heavy kind. The kind that reminded her she had no one to call, no one expecting her. Just Lily, fast asleep in the small room down the hall, curled up under thin layers of mismatched blankets. The blanket Sarah had given away wasn't just any blanket, it was Lily's favorite. The one she'd wrapped around her during fevers, tantrums, and thunderstorms. The one that still smelled faintly of baby lotion and laundry detergent. Sarah closed her eyes and leaned against the wall. Guilt tugged at her chest. She'd done the right thing, she knew she had. But that didn't make it easier. She'd given away something personal, something meaningful, and now the emptiness inside her echoed even louder. She walked toward the bedroom and peeked in. Lily was there, small and still, her breathing soft. One arm hugged her stuffed bunny. Sarah tiptoed in and gently adjusted the covers, tucking in the cold edges. She brushed a curl from Lily's forehead and whispered, "I'm sorry, sweetheart." Back in the living room, she sank into the old couch. The springs groaned beneath her weight. She let herself go still. Just for a minute. Just to rest. Her phone sat face down on the table. She didn't want to check it. Didn't want to see what was waiting. Messages from utility companies, overdue notices, reminders of everything she couldn't fix. But she knew she couldn't avoid it forever. She picked it up and tapped the screen. 2 missed calls. 1 voicemail. And a new text message. The voicemail could wait, but the text caught her attention immediately. It was from the landlord. "Sarah, this is your final reminder. Rent was due last week. If payment is not received by Friday, we begin eviction proceedings. No exceptions." She stared at the screen until it blurred. Friday. 3 days. She had $62 in her account, and tips from the night barely added up to $47. Her paycheck wasn't due until next week. She couldn't borrow more. Everyone she knew was just as stretched as she was. Her chest tightened. She didn't cry, not yet. She was too tired. There was no space left for panic, not tonight. Just a numb weight settling in her stomach like a stone. She went to the kitchen and filled a glass of water, holding it under the tap for longer than necessary. The faucet sputtered for a second before the stream caught. She wondered if that would be the next thing to go. Electricity, water, gas. They were all on borrowed time now. The fridge was nearly empty. A few slices of bread. A half-used jar of peanut butter. No milk. No fruit. No leftovers. She opened the cupboard, canned beans, a box of rice, 2 ramen packets. She did the math in her head. It would stretch a few days. Maybe. But only if she skipped meals. Again. Back on the couch, she wrapped herself in her coat. Her blanket was gone. The one thing she'd had for the cold nights. Her arms felt bare, her legs aching. The couch had no cushion left. The apartment was quiet again. But in that stillness, a question lingered. Had she made a mistake? She hadn't thought so at the time. The man had needed help. He had looked like he was at the edge of survival, sitting there trembling with no protection from the wind. How could she have walked past him? She wouldn't have. She couldn't. That was who she was. Even when she had nothing, she gave. Even when no one gave to her, she still found ways to care. That thought offered her the faintest warmth. Not comfort. Not hope. but a threat of something close. She didn't regret what she had done, not truly. What she regretted was that the world didn't make room for people like her. That kindness seemed to cost the ones who could afford it the least. And yet, something inside her remained intact. Call it dignity. Call it faith. Call it stubbornness. She didn't know, but it kept her going. It always had. She lay on the couch, eyes wide open, staring at the cracked ceiling. Somewhere above, a neighbor's radio hummed. Somewhere outside, the wind whispered down the street. Friday was coming, but so was tomorrow. And tomorrow, she'd get up and go to work and keep giving, because that's what she did. Because that's who she was. The morning air felt heavier than usual. Sarah adjusted her uniform as she stood behind the counter at the diner, refilling coffee for the third time in an hour. The clinking of dishes, the hiss of the griddle, and the buzz of conversation all faded into the background of her thoughts. Her focus was fractured, rent looming, bills stacking, and Lily's lunch barely scraped together from leftovers. She didn't notice the man at first. He wasn't irregular. Well-dressed, calm, and oddly out of place. No briefcase. No laptop. Just a folder tucked neatly under one arm. He waited near the service counter, not seated, not ordering, just waiting. "Sarah Johnson?" he asked when her eyes met his. His voice was polite but firm. She froze. No one ever came looking for her like this. "Yes?" she said cautiously, stepping forward. "I'm with the Hale Foundation," he said, handing her the folder. "We'd like you to review some documents when you have a moment." Her hands hesitated. Hale Foundation? She had never heard of it. She opened the folder slowly, expecting a survey or a flyer. Instead, it held pages, documents with her name printed at the top, confirmations of paid rent, bank statements for a new account in her name, and a letter outlining a full scholarship for Lily. She blinked, unable to process. This isn't right," she murmured. "It is," the man replied gently. "It's real. Consider it recognition. For something you did that mattered." She looked up, heart racing. "Who sent this?" "I'm not at liberty to say," he replied with a faint smile. "But you've made an impression." And just like that, he turned and walked out, leaving her in the middle of the diner, holding papers that didn't feel real, her world already beginning to shift beneath her feet. Sarah had reread the documents a dozen times since that morning. She locked herself in the small bathroom at the back of the diner during her break, hands trembling as she traced every printed word. It was all real. Every signature, every bank deposit confirmation, every legal stamp. Her rent had been paid for a year in advance. A new account had been opened in her name with enough to erase her debts. And Lily, sweet, bright Lily, had a future she could not have imagined, a full scholarship to a private early education program. But the question haunted her, why? Why her? The name Hale Foundation didn't ring any bells. She had never applied for any program, never filled out a form, never reached out for help, not because she didn't need it, but because she'd long stopped believing help would ever come. By the time her shift ended, her head spun with questions. The man had said it was recognition, for something that mattered. But what had she done? She was no one special. She just worked, loved her daughter, and gave what little she had when someone needed it more. That evening, Sarah walked Lily home from daycare under a quiet sky. For the first time in months, the air didn't feel heavy. She held her daughter's hand tightly, not knowing how to explain any of it, because she didn't understand it herself. 3 days later, an invitation arrived by mail. It was printed on thick cardstock with gold lettering, addressed simply to Sarah Johnson and guest. An event hosted by the Hale Foundation at the Langston Hotel ballroom. She'd never even set foot inside a place like that. Part of her wanted to throw the envelope away, to dismiss it as a mistake. But another part, quiet but insistent, urged her to go. So she did. She borrowed a dress from Mrs. Nellie. It was simple, navy blue, and 2 sizes too big, but Sarah pinned it at the waist and did her best with her hair. She asked a friend to watch Lily for the evening and walked into the ballroom like someone trying not to look lost. The room was vast, glowing with chandeliers and lined with rows of chairs facing a stage. A banner hung overhead, celebrating everyday heroes. She almost turned around then. Surely this isn't for me, she thought. But before she could escape, a woman in a black suit approached her. "Miss Johnson, right this way." The woman led her down the side aisle to a reserved seat in the front row. Sarah sat, trying not to fidget, heart pounding louder than the ambient music filling the room. Around her were faces she didn't recognize, some elegant, others simple like her, but all seemed to share the same quiet curiosity. The lights dimmed. A man stepped onto the stage. At first, she didn't recognize him. Gone were the torn clothes, the sunken cheeks, the knit cap pulled low. His suit was tailored, his posture strong. But then he looked out at the audience, and for a brief second, his gaze caught hers. And she knew. It was the man from the bench. The one she had given Lily's blanket to. Gasps rippled through the room as the announcer spoke his name. Richard Hale. Billionaire. Philanthropist. Founder of the Hale Foundation. Sarah's breath caught. He stepped up to the microphone, his voice calm, steady. 3 months ago, I began an experiment, he said. Not in technology or finance, but in humanity. I wanted to see if compassion still lived in quiet corners of our world. If kindness, real, selfless kindness, could still be found. He paused. I disguised myself. I walked the streets, slept outside, sat on benches with nothing but a threadbare coat. I watched the world pass. Most looked away. Some gave change. But one person gave more. The spotlight shifted. Onto Sarah. She shrank in her chair, overwhelmed. All eyes were on her now. One cold night, he continued. A woman walking home from a long shift offered me the only warmth she had left, a child's blanket. Not knowing who I was. Not asking for anything in return. A large screen behind him lit up, displaying a photo, the bench, the blanket, him, huddled under it. Sarah felt her throat tighten. She had no reason to stop, Richard said. She had bills, a child, a life already filled with struggle. But she chose kindness anyway. And that moment reminded me of something I had forgotten, that the greatest wealth isn't in what we keep, but what we give. The room erupted in applause. Sarah sat frozen, heart pounding, unsure whether to smile or cry. Richard stepped down from the stage and approached her. Sarah, he said gently, offering a hand. You changed my life that night. I didn't do anything, she whispered. You did, he said. You reminded me what humanity looks like. He helped her onto the stage as the audience stood, clapping. Lights flashed, cameras clicked, but all Sarah could think about was Lily's face. Her daughter would grow up with a future now. Not because Sarah had begged for it, but because she'd given what little she had without hesitation. Richard turned to the crowd. Let her story be a reminder. Sometimes, the ones with the least to spare are the ones who give the most. As Sarah stood beside him, tears welled in her eyes, not from shock or pressure or fear, but from something much deeper. Relief, gratitude, hope. For once, the world had noticed her, not as a struggling waitress or a single mother barely hanging on, but as someone who mattered. And as the lights dimmed again, she smiled. Because that one blanket, that one moment, had rewritten the story of her life. If you enjoyed this story, ensure to like, share, and subscribe for more amazing, heartfelt stories like this. Also, let us know where you are watching from, and drop your thoughts in the comments. Mention the names of the characters like Sarah, Lily, and Mr. Hale. What would you have done in her place? Have you ever witnessed or experienced a small act of kindness that changed everything? We love hearing your reflections and real-life moments. Your support helps us bring you more stories that touch the heart and inspire hope. Don't forget, sometimes, the smallest gesture can change a life forever.